One question I have, I don't know about you, but for me, unlike with the Soviet Union, and I know I was born there, but even outside of that, the cultural gap, the loss in translation, the communication gap between China and the United States seems to be much greater than that of what was the former Soviet Union and the United States. I see two cultures intermingling and communicating as one of the ways to de-escalate future conflict.
It's an interesting question. I mean, it is sort of an abstract theoretical level. My argument is that great powers act according to realist dictates,
Mm-hmm.
and they understand those realist dictates, and that can lead to cooperation or it can lead to war. It depends. I would say, just in the case of the Soviets, a lot of people describe the Cold War as an ideological competition above all else. It was communism versus liberal democracy, or communism versus liberal capitalism, whatever. I actually don't believe that. I believe the Soviets were realists to the core. I believe Stalin was a realist par excellence. And that ideology did not matter much in Stalin's foreign policy. And I believe if you look at Soviet foreign policy after World War II, throughout the Cold War, they were realists to the core. And I think in those days, the Americans were realists, right? A lot of liberal ideology floating around out there, but the Americans were realists. And I think one of the reasons you avoided a shooting match between the United States and the Soviet Union from 47 to 89 was because both sides, I think, understood basic balance of power logic. U.S.-China competition is somewhat different. First of all, the Chinese are realists to the core. I've spent a lot of time in China. I basically have rock and roll. I'm basically a rock and roll star in China. The Chinese,
You're kind of a big deal in China. I love it.
the Chinese are my kind of people.
Yeah.
They're realists, right? They
Yeah.
speak my language.
Yeah.
It's the United States that is not very realist.
Yeah.
American leaders have a very powerful liberal bent and tend not to see the world in realist terms. I believe, by the way, just going back to our discussion of NATO expansion, I think our inability to understand that NATO expansion was anathema to the Russians, was due in large part to the fact that we just, during the unipolar moment, didn't think of international politics from a realist perspective, and didn't respect anyone who thought about international politics from a realist perspective. If those various American administrations, starting with the Clinton administration, had put their realist hat on, they would have understood that NATO expansion into Ukraine was not a good idea. But we had this thoroughly liberal view of the world that dominated our thinking. And it's gone away somewhat since we've moved into multipolarity, but not completely. And this makes me a little nervous, right, to pick up on your point. I mean, the United States is thinking about the world in ways that are somewhat different than the Chinese, who are realists par excellence.
So that's fascinating. So the Chinese are pragmatic about thinking of the world in as a competition of military powers, all the ways in which you described the realist perspective. So that's a hopeful thing, right? If we can achieve stability and a balance of powers through that military competition.
Yeah, I actually think that's right. I think if the United States, just let me talk a little bit about the United States to get at the issue you're raising. If the United States pursues a smart containment strategy, given what you just said and I said about the Chinese, I think we will avoid war. The problem with the Americans is it's not just the liberalism. It's the possibility that we will pursue a rollback policy. In other words, during the Cold War, we pursued containment. It was whenever anybody talked about American grand strategy towards the Soviet Union, it was containment, containment, containment. We now know from the historical record that the United States was not only pursuing containment, it was pursuing rollback. We were trying to roll back Soviet power. To put it bluntly, we were trying to wreck the Soviet Union, okay? And I would not be surprised moving forward with regard to China if the United States pursues a serious rollback policy. And
So you're saying throughout history, the United States was always doing that? Always. Well, where's that from? Why can't we respect the power of other nations?
because they may be a threat to us. We
Well, I mean,
you don't look. You don't respect the power of other nations. You fear the power of other nations.
well, fear and respect are next door neighbors, depending on the neighborhood you're living in. But I just mean it could be very counterproductive to try, because if you can empathize with if you assume they're rational actors, you trying to roll back will create, would lean into the uncertainty of potential conflict. So you want to avoid the uncertainty of potential conflict. Caution, right?
Well, yes and no. But look, your point is you want to empathize. You want to be able to put yourself in
Yes.
the shoes of the other side.
Yes.
I agree 100% with that, right? It's very important if you're a first-class strategist to be able to do that. But at the same time, there is this competition for power taking place. And what you want to do is maximize how much power you have relative to the other side. And the other side wants to maximize how much power it has relative to you. So you have this competition for power, right? That's taking place all the time. And that's taking place at the same time you want to have empathy, or you want to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other side. So those two things kind of go together, right?
It just feels less threatening to build up your thing versus try to hurt the other person's thing, the other group's thing.
Right. But if you build up your own power, you are building up your capability to hurt the other side.
Right. But
This-
like you do, I guess you don't rattle the saber. Just work on manufacturing sabers.
Well, that I agree with. I think that, the United States, wants to make sure it has a big stick in East Asia for purposes of containing China and avoiding a war, right? Again, I want to be clear. I'm not advocating that we start World War III. But the point is you want to have a big stick. And you want to make sure that you don't overstep your bounds in terms of using that big stick. This is the danger with rollback, right? That you get too aggressive and you precipitate a war, right? And you also just have to be very careful what you say. And to go back to your favorite argument, you want to be able to have empathy or put yourself in the shoes of the other side. Because if you do something, you want to think smartly about what that other side, how that other side is going to see your action and how they're going to react, right?
And mostly focus on the carrots. Have a giant stick laying around, but never mention it. Just focus on the carrots.
Well, occasionally you have to mention the stick, right?
No, everyone knows the stick is there. I mean,
There is some truth in that, right?
yeah. But and words matter a lot. It feels, this our current President Biden is meeting with Xi Jinping, and I think the words exchanged there are really important. I have a notion that leaders can stop wars just as much as they can start wars.
Well, leaders matter. There's no question about that. No question. But just on rhetoric, you want to remember that Putin has, on more than one occasion, very subtly rattled the nuclear sword.
Oh, yeah.
And it has been very effective.
Yeah.
Because Joe Biden has paid attention, and Joe Biden wants to make sure we don't end up in a thermonuclear war. And thank goodness he's thinking that way. So all Putin has to do is mention the possibility of nuclear war. Just to go back to Taiwan, switch areas of the world. If you're interested in containing China and you're interested in deterrence, and let's go back to those various scenarios where the Chinese win, we win, Chinese win, but they do it at great cost. One could argue that discussion that I laid out before didn't take into account nuclear weapons. And all President Biden or any of his successors has to do is just very subtly rattle
Mhm.
or employ the nuclear threat,
Mhm.
uh, and just sort of remind the Chinese that,
Mhm.
you start a war over Taiwan, it could easily escalate into a nuclear war. You want to understand, we both have nuclear weapons. And if either one of us is put into a desperate situation, we may turn to those nuclear weapons. And oh, by the way, Xi Jinping, you want to understand that we're out here in the water and using nuclear weapons in the water. It's not the same as using nuclear weapons on land. So we may very well use them. I'm not saying we will. But anyway, a little saber rattling,
Yeah.
right?